Every civilization leaves behind traces of what it valued, its stories, its knowledge, its way of understanding the world. Today we live in a world of unprecedented intelligence. Information moves faster than ever before, yet many societies struggle to answer a simpler question: who are we becoming? Horizon explores a foundational idea. What if culture is not simply part of society, but the foundation beneath it? Welcome to Horizon, the Council for Culture, Intelligence and Human Continuity, presented by the Age of Culture Project.
Welcome everyone, and thanks again for joining us for Horizon. One thing that keeps surfacing across these conversations is that culture is constantly described as important. Governments speak about it, institutions celebrate it, cities market themselves through it, and organizations increasingly build entire narratives around diversity, creativity, and belonging. And yet, when societies make their most consequential decisions around economics, education, technology, planning, and governance, culture often still feels secondary, something symbolic, something added afterwards, a program rather than a foundation. So today's conversation asks a deliberately uncomfortable question. Has culture gradually been domesticated? Not erased, not censored, but reduced to forms that are manageable, marketable, and administratively safe, while losing much of its deeper role in shaping how societies actually hold together. And importantly, this conversation isn't simply about the arts. It's about belonging, it's about participation, it's about continuity, how societies absorb change, how cultures meet one another, and whether modern systems still possess meaningful ways for people to feel connected to shared civic life. To explore that, I'm joined by Peter Mousaferiadis. I hope I got your name right there, Peter. Peter's work has moved across creativity, intercultural dialogue, technology, peace building, and what he beautifully describes as confluence, the meeting point where cultures overlap and create something new. Peter, thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening, Michael, all the way from Melbourne, Australia.
There you go. So just a quick entry question. You often use the word confluence, and I'm wondering that's not a bad place to start. What does confluence mean to you, and what do you think modern societies increasingly misunderstand about how cultures genuinely meet?
Well, I've always understood confluence as being the lifeblood of cultures, the meeting place where cultures come together, where they meet and exchange ideas, and through that meeting place, they create something new. They learn from each other. And, culture is not exclusive. Culture for everyone a day is reinventing itself. And for culture to stay vibrant and alive, they need to be meeting with other cultures all the time. Culture is constantly adapting to the environment. And for me, coming back to that point of, uh, you know, uh, thinking of thinking of confluence as the convergence of new ideas that draw on knowledge, and knowledge is the diversification of ideas, which can bring about something new and essentially improve humanity.
I'm just wondering, it feels as if modern societies increasingly perform culture rather than live inside it. And you talk about this creation of new cultures through the merging of different cultures. And the result of that is what exactly? Is it a new culture? Talk to me a little bit about the inheritance of former cultures and the creation of, I don't want to call them new cultures or hybrid cultures, but the cultures that come out of the mixing and the meeting, as you said, of different cultures.
Back in 2013, I coined the phrase diversified we grow for the UN campaign, and I was invited to the World Forum on Intercultural Dialogue in Baku, in Azerbaijan, to talk about the slogan and why I came up with it. And when I came up with that slogan, I wasn't thinking of, well, it was really, I added that slogan to the duplex: and divided we fall, united we stand, diversified we grow. And I wasn't thinking about just social cohesion. I was thinking about how diversity of viewpoints and the diversification of knowledge can drive innovation. I was thinking of the bionic eye, for example, and how that's been the convergence of many different disciplines coming together and people from all over the world to give us something that would have seemed unimaginable 25, 30 years ago. I was thinking of the contribution of indigenous knowledge-based systems to medical intervention. I was thinking about in Saudi Arabia today they're building desalination plants which are carbon neutral free, and that didn't just come about by one culture coming up with this, but many cultures coming together and sharing ideas, sharing resources to solve the challenges that are facing humanity. So when I think about culture, I also think about it from a plural concept. When we're talking about culture, what are we talking about at the end of the day? Are we talking about ethno-linguistic culture? Are we talking about the arts, which are really a manifestation of an embodiment of ideas and exploring ideas? But I also think that to a certain extent, governments try to control a culture. And I think we're living in an age where, unlike any other period in history, where culture is under attack.
Quite a strong comment you make. The culture is under attack. You also have coined a phrase, you've talked about cultural infusion. Um, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I know you've got an interest in music and technology. Is that where you see cultural infusion playing a role, or is it something to do with global harmony, this cultural infusion? Because both you and I are second generation Australians from foreign born, non-English speaking immigrants. I would argue that we're pretty culturally infused when it comes to Australia. But what do you talk about when you talk about cultural infusion and global harmony? Talk to me a little bit about that, especially I know you have an interest in music and technology. Is there a link there?
Well, absolutely. I initially majored in religious studies at university in Cornell Greek, and then I went off and studied music at the Victorian College of the Arts in Melbourne, and then pursued a career as a conductor. Spent 4 years studying conducting overseas. I studied at the Academia Musicale Guyana. I spent some time, about 8 months, in Czechoslovakia was called then before it split. I was actually there during the split, and then I did a 6 month stint in South Bend, Indiana, studying conducting. Returned to Australia and started to work as a conductor and as a composer in the community. And before too long, I was being involved in representing uh, artists from many different cultures who weren't so imbued in the 18th, 19th century, operatic, classical, music traditions that, I'd studied. And I started to think of why so many cultures that were living in Australia, so many artists that were living in Australia that came from these traditions that predated 18th, 19th century European traditions by, in some cases, thousands of years, and were outstanding. So this was my introduction to not only the arts, but the arts of many different traditions from across the world. And at that point, I started to think of how could I start to infuse these different traditions into everyday life. But it wasn't only just infuse these traditions with everyday life, it was how through this point of confluence we could then start to foster intercultural exchange and intercultural competency as this core value of what it means to be a global citizen today. And how through this intercultural exchange we can build empathy and discovering ourselves. So as we start to discover the other, we discover other traditions, we start to reflect deeply about who we are ourselves. And through that exchange, it brings us closer to each other. And today we need to do that more than ever, especially because of this digital age that we're living in. And we'll probably talk about later why I think culture is under attack. And when I talk about culture, I'm talking about the diversity of cultural expressions that exist within this world. There are something like 8,500, ethno-linguistic and people groups. There's something like 10, 11,000 languages and speech variations and speech communities. And that's disappearing at a cataclysmic rate. Linguists are telling us that in the next 100 years, we'll probably go from 8,500 languages to 2,000 languages. Think of what that would mean to humanity with every language that disappears. The knowledge-based systems, the value-based systems that are tied up within a language that's connected also to a people group, to a culture. So when I think of this work of cultural infusion, and I should actually share the story about how cultural infusion came about. I'm sort of digressing a little bit here, but I think it might
No, please
interest
do. We love stories.
the listeners. I went to my partner. I'd been married to her for 4 years. We've been together for 6 years. And I said to her, look, I want to develop an education program. I've been working in, as a conductor, composer. I'm now starting to segue out of that into, representing, artists from many different backgrounds. And I think we need to really focus on education. And we need to, take the cultures of the world through all the myriad of, these artistic traditions, and really use that as a way of being able to, reduce ethnic and race-based discrimination. And I think there's no better way than the arts to do that. And I said, I need a name for it. And she turned around to me and she said, I came up with all these boring names, multicultural program and this program and this program. And she said, go and get me a cup of tea and don't forget to leave the tea bag in there and 2 teaspoons of sugar. And I was so excited because I thought, I'm going to come up with a name now. And of course, I ran up the hallway, made the cup of tea, came back and I spilt a little bit of it and I gave it to her and I started talking and she said, silence, please. And of course, at that moment, I felt like I had Atlas. I felt like Atlas and the world on my shoulders. And there was silence. I thought, what have I done now? And then as she was dunking the tea bag
Yes.
into the cup of tea, she looked at me and she said, that's it. For as long as I've known you, you've been infusing people with culture. Let's call it cultural infusion. And of course, that's where the name started. So I attribute the name to Aphrodite, my partner. And of course, the education program, I'd already been working on, putting the strategy together, building the databases. We released the program in the end of 2002, and within 18 months, the program just took off. It went national. We went to like 300,000 students, and every year since 2002, we've been delivering this program across Australia. And what we're addressing is we're trying to address this, ethnic and race-based discrimination and recognize that the drivers of it are fear and ignorance. So the counter drivers of it become familiarization, collaboration, and education. And no better way than creating the lived experience, the authentic experience of a student to experience an artistic tradition from another part of the world, storytelling, and then and that student being taken to another world, and all of a sudden that encounter creates not only this appreciation, it breaks down barriers instantly, and also creates this education. So through that process, we're able to also support these students with a whole range of intercultural learning materials and professional development for teachers. And that's been sort of a staple part of our organization. So that was initially the first program. And of course, we started to expand in different programs. But before that, I do want to say I also worked as a creative director and produced a lot of opening and closing ceremonies and continued to do that work right up until 2012. I think the last one I did was 2014 and then segued out of that into what I'm doing today. But I want to just share a few experiences as a creative director when I was thrusted into this space because I had this capacity of being able to bring people together from many different backgrounds. Often my brief when I was working on a UN opening ceremony, it was, we want you to bring all these different cultures together from these different traditions. So how do you bring together, a Japanese shakuhachi performer and a hip hop beatbox vocalizer and a didgeridoo sound and a bagpiper who's going to probably play in a different key and you're not going to be able to tune him? How do you bring these different traditions together? And it was at that point in time I started to think of these concepts of diversity and I began to think of these concepts of inclusion. I mean, how do you create inclusion when you've got these completely different worlds of how we approach music, different tuning systems? So you have to start to make decisions, and then you have to get everyone to buy into these collective decisions. And sometimes some people can't, you know, there's almost this misalignment with the tradition of that individual, and they have to accommodate to be able to come into this overarching culture that we're trying to create. Because, if people are performing in 8 different musical systems, you just have to choose a musical tuning system and say, this is the tuning system we're going to all stick to, and we're going to all get everyone to work with. And of course, that required a lot of conversation, but more importantly, it required you to have a deep understanding of the other. And often, what we do with the other is we make people feel invisible. So, through this process, began to understand that the concept of inclusion, trying to put it into a reality, requires a set of criteria and a whole set of rules that people need to abide by. And if they don't, then sometimes there might be consequences that come with that. So this applies to every setting. It applies to every organization. It also applies to nation states. And yeah, so
it's interesting because you make it sound like visibility doesn't mean intrusion. Intrusion doesn't mean disharmony because you're bringing these people together, but there's a sense of belonging and they all have their place. And there's that expression we use in English, to sing from the same songbook. You had them basically trying to play in the same key. So there's some degree of unification, but at the same time, everyone has their piece to play. So you've got this, you used the word diversity in the beginning, but it's a very harmonious diversity because would it be fair to say everyone knows their place and everyone's doing what fits in rather than
well,
just doing different things?
well, what they're fitting into is the dominant culture. And that's how
Right.
society runs. So when we're talking about music tuning systems, the Western tuning system is based on equal temperament. So we take, the octave and we divide it into 12 equal half tones, 12 semitones. But not all music systems are like that. In some cultures, in ancient Greece, and the Makar modal system, they divided the tone into 12 microtones. So when I hear my nephew, who's an exponent of Byzantine chant, he divides the tone into 4/12 of a tone or 5/12 of a tone. He can hear the difference. So when he sings a major scale, the first time I heard him sing it, I thought that sounds out of tune. This is in the early 90s. And he goes, no, 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 no. He goes, I'm not singing out of tune. This is the tuning system. So that was a huge, a learning curve for me that I didn't know there were different tuning systems out there in the world. And there are many different tuning systems out there. So at the end of the day, you cannot bring a tuning system of, one culture and try to amalgamate it with another 10 different tuning systems because it's just going to sound like soup at the end of the day. So you need to make a decision. And when we come to thinking of this concept of diversity, when I think of that word diversity, to me it just means difference. So I start to apply a series of metrics to that difference. So cultures that might be closely aligned. So if you look at, let's take language, for example, and you look at, Italian, French, Portuguese, and Spanish languages, and then you took another four languages, which were Spanish, Arabic, Japanese, and let's say the language of the Warong people here in Melbourne, Australia, the indigenous people, they come from four totally different languages. So the metric that describes what's going on here in terms of diversity is uh, disparity, the dissimilarity of the languages. So it's easier, to make sense of these Romance speaking languages, which are more closely aligned. But when you've got four different languages, there's going to be huge variations when it comes to how they shape their experiences. And that's going to be informed by their ethno-linguistic background because that informs a whole series of cognitive processes. So when we start to navigate through this world of culture, it requires us to have an understanding of these different ways of seeing the world. And, call it cross-cultural competency, call it intercultural understanding. This becomes vital today as our world is becoming increasingly globalized and is accelerating because of the World Wide Web. And this has really come about in the last 30 years. Prior to 1989, we had no World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee gifted it to us. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves living in this super diverse world where time and space have been compressed and we're exposed to so many different ideas. So how do we navigate our way through these different ways that people see the world? That requires knowledge. It requires competency. It requires humility.
You mentioned one thing before about dominant culture, and I'm just coming back to this dominant culture idea because you mentioned the World Wide Web. And is it not fair to say that cultural dominance is perhaps one of the reasons why the other point you mentioned, a number of these languages are disappearing because people don't really see the point in pursuing a language that's spoken by 8,000 people. They can't really get anywhere. So they're abandoning their heritage, their linguistic heritage, for facility. And it's, to me, it's a little bit like social fragmentation to some extent, and we're losing it. So what needs to be done, do you think, to sort of protect and preserve that linguistic heritage in the context we have today with the World Wide Web and with this dominant culture, which let's call it what it is, Anglophones?
You raised a few points there. I might focus on the first point. What can we do? I would reframe, the question, what is the impact of not doing anything and not finding ways to protect, promote, revitalize these intangible traditions? And we're focusing on language. Think of what it means when a language disappears. Something of humanity is lost during that process. Because even if I think of my primary language, which was Greek, and having studied Koine Greek, there were 20 different types of love. Some cultures only have one word for love. Others have 16. Others have more than 20. So when I hear the word love in English, I'm quickly trying to work out in my head what type of love that person is talking about. So I think we have to find better ways to be able to focus on recognizing the value and the knowledge that's housed within every single language, because a language just doesn't evolve overnight. It
Right.
evolves over a long period of time. And there are all sorts of thought patterns that go into, you know, to languages. So your point about what does it mean? Why should we bother if there's only 8,000, 8,000 speakers left or even five speakers left? Well, I ask you the question, how would you feel, Michael, if you were the last speaker of English?
But that's the point you make about humanity. It's a piece of humanity that disappears irrevocably. And I think that's where the sadness comes from, is that it's a piece of us. Even though we're not part of that culture, it's nevertheless part of human culture. And I think if that part of humanity were to be lost, I think it'd be part of us that were lost. And you've mentioned Aborigines in Australia a lot, and there's a linguistic bloodbath going on there because fewer and fewer tribes are practicing their traditional languages. And there's not much we can do to protect that. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I'm
I
sure you've
think there
got
are
some
movements now
ideas.
to resurrect some of the dormant languages at the moment,
Correct, yes.
and that's really reassuring to see. But that requires investment from governments. Uh, you know, uh, yeah, I mean, we've gone from 700, indigenous languages and speech communities to, I think there's 50 that are spoken today, and only 15 that are spoken by, the grandchildren. But there are efforts being made. That's my understanding.
I'm going to go off on a tangent here because there has to be a desire to do that. And my question is the desire there? And I'm not just limiting this to Aboriginal languages, but also to other regional languages. When you look at, for example, Europe, and you look at some of the smaller languages, there's a lot of political push to preserve languages like Basque, but there's not a lot of speakers left. And in parts of Denmark, from where my wife comes, there are Danish dialects that are disappearing because there's fewer than 100 people who speak them.
Yeah.
And it's a question for society, I suppose, what is it worth to us? And I think comes back to Paul Schaefer's comment about the age of economics. Yeah, but what does it bring us if we save a language economically? And I'm not convinced it brings us anything, and that's part of the problem. But as people, as human beings, we lose part of ourselves. And I think it's a great sadness to see languages disappearing. So I suppose is the question that I'm coming to is we talked before with some of our other speakers about we can't put a price tag on culture, but there are other ways of valuing culture. And it may not be your realm of expertise, but how do you value the linguistic wealth of some of these countries or peoples? And what would you do to sort of reassure the continuity of some of these linguistic traditions?
If I think of places like India and Pakistan that I visited, you travel literally every 50 kilometers, there's a new language. It's not even a dialect that's
Yeah.
spoken. And the first time I traveled through Pakistan, I was on a government visit, and every 50 kilometers, there was a new vehicle that would be waiting for us to take us into that region with people that spoke their language. And I didn't understand why. And they said, no, because the current people that we've got, don't speak the language of these, people. So we need to change the vehicle because when they get stopped on the roads and they're asked all sorts of questions, the current drivers can't speak that language. And it was just absolutely mind blowing to see so much linguistic diversity within close proximity. And I know even in Northern Australia, I met this Aboriginal outer back in the 90s who told me he was in his, I think he was well into his 70s then. He was thrown into a prison in the Vapor region, the top end of Australia. And he said there were only two of us that spoke the same language out of 20 people, 20 Aboriginals that were in the prison. So even in places like Papua New Guinea, I mean, literally every 3, 4 kilometers, there's a new language that's spoken. Um, and one of the great drivers, incidentally, I'm just going off on a tangent here, of linguistic diversity has been inhospitable terrain and
Yeah.
headhunters. So in the past, when people knew there were headhunters coming, they would flee off into the mountains, and all of a sudden the language would start to evolve and change. And you mentioned Basque earlier on. Basque is it's not a language isolate. No one knows where they came from. There are about 70 or 80 language isolates. left in the world. I'm not a linguistic expert, so I really can't comment on, you know, do we need to be preserving these languages? Um, I think sometimes languages will naturally fade out, yes. Uh, but what concerns me is with the digital age that it's to an extent it's essentializing culture, and it's also homogenizing culture across
Yes.
the world. And I still don't think we know what the impact of that's going to be. Um, it's getting us to think a certain way in English. AI is only available in 80 key languages. What does that mean for the other 8,420 languages out there in the world? I'm not too sure, and I think only history will tell us what the impact of this technological age, where to an extent it's essentializing culture, and I'll speak to that maybe later if we have time. And what I mean by that,
Well, we will.
it's fixating identity, fixating how we describe ourselves. Um, I don't know what that means on the psyche yet, because I know that my grandfather had three different names in the first 23 years of his life. You know, I know my father's name was spelled incorrectly when he arrived here, and his Christian name, he had, so many different variations of his Christian name on all his identification. And that's because, when it comes to naming is, it's part of culture, and culture is changing all the time. But today I'm finding that the digital age is saying, oh, you can only have one name now. And I find it really difficult because on my passport, my name isn't Peter, it's Panayotis, and it's on my birth certificate, but no one knows me as that. And that's created all sorts of complications. I don't have an issue with the name Peter, but the the extent that you've got to go to change these things.
Yeah.
And I don't know how the digital age is going to allow for uh, the lifeblood of culture, which is confluence, and it's forever in a day changing. Cultures need to be reinventing themselves because they're adapting to the environment. So tomorrow, Pete, my name might change again. It might change to Pete, or my children might want to change their name to something else because people refer to them as something, and that name sticks, and all of a sudden, it's a new name.
Yeah, it's a worry, isn't it? That it's almost as if simplicity rules over cultural wealth, so to speak. It's too hard. You talked about dominant cultures, and sometimes the dominant culture doesn't want to make the effort. Use the word empathy as well. Isn't empathetic enough about the other culture. It's not about the one culture disappearing or being, you talked about infusion or being sucked up into the dominant culture, but there is a meeting of the two cultures. And I think a little bit of empathy, and you use the word knowledge, understanding, eliminating ignorance, can go a long way, I think, to promoting the coexistence of the cultures. And I suppose that's the difference, isn't it? What is the difference between cultural coexistence and cultural participation, if you understand the question?
Yes, that's a really good question. And I'm just thinking of it in the frame of everything that's going on in the world at the moment. We've
Mm.
seen the United States, and I read an article recently in the New York Times where um, the Trump administration is starting to purge all these words. Cultural difference, cultural heritage, cultural sensitivity. We've seen how, uh, nation states in the past have, tried to um, abolish certain traditions. Okay, culture keeps on bouncing back. I
I was
don't
about
think
to
we
say.
suppress culture to a full extent. Um, I don't know if that fully answers the question and where you're going. Um, yeah, so I'm sorry. Can you just repeat that question again?
Well, it's the
Sorry,
question. I suppose it's the difference in meaning between coexistence and participation. And
yeah,
it's interesting because you're talking about infusion before, and it brings me back to chemistry. You can have a mixture or you can have a solution. The
yeah.
one
So
is
when I think of
infused into
coexistence,
the others they sort of just move around.
yeah, for me, coexistence, implies we're living side by side. And we
Yeah.
can, does it imply we're living in harmony? Not too sure. Does participation mean we're living in harmony? I'm not too sure either. I think our societies need to become more intercultural, where we're fostering greater exchange between different cultures. And I think that's more important. Coexistence implies a tolerance of the other. It doesn't imply an acceptance of the other. And I'm not too sure whether we need to accept everything either, by the same token.
I'm not so sure we have to tolerate everything either.
No, no, yeah, exactly, exactly. I don't think we have to tolerate everything, um, and I think there's certain things we don't need to tolerate, and they're the decisions that the nation state needs to,
Yeah.
make at the end of the day. It needs to decide on, well, it decides on the language, which is going to be the dominant language at the end of the day, and it says, well, this is the dominant language. It's English, so we require everyone to be able to communicate in that language. Of course, it makes some exceptions and tries to assist people, but there's no way in the world it can turn around and say, well, um, you know, uh, we're going to allow for the administration to be in every single language of every single person because it's not humanly possible. Or there might be some aspects of some traditions, which, for example, FGM, female genital mutilation, where a nation state will say, no, we're not going to allow that. Um, and it may even come to how we speak to each other and how we engage with each other in dialogue. So that's why we develop rules and we develop a set of social norms and cultural norms that we want everyone to abide by. I think I think our governments need to do more work in creating understanding between different people and building that intercultural competency so people can communicate with others because the modern nation states, opening its borders. We're becoming more globalized than ever. So if we're going to do that, it means then we have to be able to understand where the other's coming from. Who are these, migrants that we're allowing to come in? We have to make some concession and we have to try to meet them where they're at.
It's interesting you said that. I would challenge you on that we're becoming more global. Yes, we are. But I believe that there is more of a reassertion of the nation state. And maybe it's a backlash of the immigration where people are saying, no, we don't want to be multicultural. We have our local traditions, we have our local rituals, we have our local language, and we want to perpetuate those. And Australia is as good an example as any. I think it's swinging between the two and starting to understand and this we talked about tolerance and what's acceptable. And you used female genital mutilation, which is a very good example of something that we will not accept, cannot accept, and will never tolerate. So it's these sorts of things. I think the nation state needs to sort of say, we have a culture, we have our codes, and part of that there's a legal framework. So I suppose, what do we have? What are the meaningful mechanisms for integration, mutual adaptation, for example, and doesn't have to go as far as it used to be in the good old 50s in Australia, assimilation, where you just disappeared. But it's interesting that you do use the word coexistence, but do the people get on with each other? Not necessarily, because if you scratch the surface, there can still be some residual hostility or what's the word? Not, I'm thinking of the word in French, méfiance, fear, basically. There's still that residual fear because it comes from ignorance. So I think we've got work to do. Governments have work to do to bring these countries together. But let me come back to what you talked about before about dominant
Can I
culture.
just chime in there? I think for some nation
Absolutely.
states it's easier than others. A lot
Yeah.
of monocultural or nation states that are predominantly monocultural, it's easier for them to go, well, this is the way we do things. And
Yes.
everyone gets it because of the the cultural norms and the social norms that come with that particular ethno-linguistic culture. But when you have a nation state like Australia, which is made up of many different uh, diversity of expressions, cultural diversity expressions, it becomes harder. And I think the best nation states are those that can give um, visibility to everyone. And when they're not, to an extent, they're failing. And and I'm not saying that they have to, the nation state has to change, but it has to get better at going, how can I draw on the wealth of who we are as a collective people and form an identity based on that. And that identity can still stay as it is within the predominantly Anglo-Saxon culture. And I don't think that's going to change overnight. And I don't think it needs to change overnight because we're operating in the dominant language. I don't know what's going to happen in 200 years or 300 years from now. We have a democratic system, and the democratic system ultimately decides which direction we're going to go in. And of course, some nation states don't have a democratic system because the Western style democracy wouldn't work for them. I mean, the UAE, Qatar. I don't think a Western style democracy would work in China. It will probably implode. Um, but I think the beauty of the nation state today is it needs to be able to distinguish itself from other nation states and needs to be able to form an identity that it can be proud of. I think the US did that very well in the 20th century. It took grassroots initiatives, it took tap dancing, it took jazz, it took, the folklore, it took, literature. I mean, look what it did. It basically took New Orleans culture to a large extent and it took it to the whole world.
Yeah.
So I think we can do a lot better.
No, it's true. The United States in the 20th century was a culturally incredibly rich place in terms of what it generated. Um, and it seems to be that that's sort of tapering off for some reason. It's losing its cultural vibe, maybe. I don't know. But there are pockets in the United States, but the US is sort of, to me, the United States in the 20th century was just an incredible place, culturally speaking. Now you sort of think, has it lost its mojo?
Yeah,
Sort of
and that
thing.
probably has a lot to do with the sort of post-truth age that we're living in, the postmodernist period where, you know, the constructivist phase of the last 4 or 5 decades where there are no boundaries, everything is being contested, and we've been so consumed with minutia when a place like America created this dominant culture. It got everyone to be have applied it in that dominant culture, and at the same time said, "Yeah, you can have your own culture too. We've opened up our borders, and if you want to continue being Greek, you can. But we've created a new culture." That you can also be really proud of. And I think the United States did that really well. I mean, I love jazz. I'm a great fan of jazz. I love rock and roll music. I love so many aspects of American culture. And I know it's been demonized and, in the last few decades. But there's some, great aspects of, American culture. And I think, Australia is almost there. It almost got there. I think we've, in the last, 3 decades, we've sort of gone backwards because we're trying to find try to understand who we are. But I think we are in a better place than most other countries because we have so much to draw upon, and I don't think we're being clever at doing that. Uh, we draw on our natural resources. Well, it's a huge asset, but I think a bigger asset is our cultural diversity, and we're not being clever about how to foster an exchange of ideas from different cultures with the view of trying to form new ideas out of that. And new artistic traditions that can come out of that. At the moment, we're still imbued mainly in these 18th, 19th century classical operatic music and ballet traditions. And I don't have an issue with that, but I think we could be doing so much more. But that requires, to a large extent, investment or maybe no investment in the arts whatsoever, because sometimes if you have no investment, then you can't suppress culture, you can't suppress artistic traditions. People might start creating something new. And out of
I was
that,
going to challenge
newness
you
can
just on
come
that,
something
actually.
amazing
Exactly. I was going to challenge you
for
on
the
the
world.
funding of the arts because you could argue, let's not fund the arts at all, because and let's see what survives. Because at the moment you have a preset mentality defining what gets funding and what doesn't get funding,
That's
and
right.
maybe it's suppressing things that would otherwise grow and
Yeah.
fostering things that don't deserve to grow. I'm just hypothesizing. I'm not pointing the finger at anything in particular.
Yeah, yeah. I did a study on this about 20 years ago, and there was something like 27 major performing arts institutions in Australia that were receiving 67% of the total funding. And then you had another 4,500, 5,000 organizations and individuals that were squabbling over the rest. And I think we could do a lot better the way we
Yeah.
support, artistic traditions here. And there's so much amazing art. It needs a little bit of support. And yeah, let's try an experiment and just say we're not funding any arts, okay, for the next 5 years. I think we would really surprise ourselves with what would come out of those 5 years. I mean, look, I look at Greece and I saw what Greece went through with the GFC and how it's been able to reimagine
Yeah.
who it is and the amazing artistic new innovation that's been coming out, artistic innovation that's been coming out of Greece in the last 10 years is absolutely phenomenal. I think there are more theatre places in Athens than in, 42nd Street and in, Broadway in the UK that you can visit. I mean, every corner there's something exciting happening, and there's so much new art that's coming out of Greece, and that was because there was no funding for it. And because there was no very
Right.
little funding for it, artists came together and they started to create, and they created amazing, amazing art.
Yeah, I mean it's exactly, it's a bit like a, I don't want to use the word free market, but it's a free for all or a free market. But sometimes if you just
It
let
drives
people
innovation.
run, wonderful things can happen. And rather than have a, it's interesting that we're sort of quite anti-command economy, but at the same time, when it comes to art funding, that's exactly what we're doing. We're running a command economy by making decisions about who should be funded and who should not.
Yeah,
And then
what's the expression? Necessity is the
mother
what's
of
it, the
invention.
driver of all innovation, something like that.
Yeah,
Uh,
necessity is the mother of invention, I think is what they say.
I didn't want to use the word mother because today that would be considered probably inappropriate.
Oh, well, see, that's cultural. We're culturally clashing here because the traditionalist versus the innovator. I don't think, but see, that's an interesting linguistic point you make there. And you mentioned that earlier about how some words aren't used anymore, or the languages are changing. It's a metaphor, and I'd hate to see our metaphors die out.
Yeah,
But that's
yeah, a really good point. And that comes back to the topic of this whole discussion, are we
yes,
domesticating culture?
exactly.
And I think there have been some aspects of our society, especially in Australia, some fringe groups that are wielding enormous influence, creating a lot of silence. I know I've certainly been cancelled quite a few times just for taking a middle road approach on certain issues. And, all of a sudden, you take it's not even a conservative approach, it's just asking questions. And, you know, people are scared to talk now because they're going to be labeled a neo-Nazi sympathizer. And it's like, I mean, do you actually realize if you start calling everything a Nazi, everything is a Nazi and nothing is a Nazi? Do you understand the gravitas of what,
Well,
you
it's a
know?
bit like the word fascist. Everyone's a fascist these days, but the people who call people fascists are by definition the fascists. It's just, it really is quite crazy. And I think name calling doesn't promote conversations, and the lack of conversations doesn't promote knowledge. Let me just come to, we mentioned very quickly, we talked about technology. And, there's the whole technological story, there's the human encounter. And we talk about how the stories, particularly the ones that you've been mentioning, there's a lot of emotions. But data doesn't have emotions. And this brings us a little bit to the conversation we just had. It's just facts, it's just data. There are no emotions there. You can do what you want with them. But what happens, I suppose, the question that we're asking ourselves is what happens to societies as they increasingly organize themselves around data rather than lived encounters and lived experiences? That's one thing. And can technology strengthen human connection, or does it risk flattening culture into just information and killing off the cultural dimension? What's your read on that?
There's the huge risk if we don't have inclusive data sets,
Right.
then we're starting to flatten identity. We're starting to erase important aspects of identity. We start to homogenize, and we can end up perpetuating exclusion and inequality.
Yeah.
So I think when it comes to human identity and unpacking the complexity of human identity, we need more data. Because at the moment, we're using these broad social constructs that are creating exactly what we don't want, which is flattening identity. So I think we need more data when it comes to human beings because we don't understand uh, ourselves enough. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing at our organization now. We've become more or less a data organization. We're working with big data. We see cultural diversity as being a national asset. We recognize the importance of nuanced data. Referring to you and I now as white people, I don't know what that actually means. I can
The
understand from maybe a
labels.
socio-political construct, yes, what what the implication behind it might be, but even then, there's a whole series of assumptions. You could be a
Yes.
white person from a poor village in Albania, or you could be a white person from Buckingham Palace, or you could be an Asian person from the Bosphorus Sea, a Greek Asian like my father. He came from Cappadocia, as an Asian Greek, or you could be an East Asian from, Korea.
Yes. It's
So I
the
think
it's the
we need to go deeper with our language,
yes.
and if we don't, then we risk perpetuating more and more exclusion.
And I think there's a link to what you're saying in this notion of flattening cultures, because flattening, in my mind, is certainly a process of simplification. And in doing so, you miss that important detail. And you start to throw around labels. It's easy, it flattens, but there's a lot more depth behind that label than the naked eye can necessarily see. And I think that's a risk we have. I'm just thinking about, we mentioned the sort of the technological side. And if we think about the generation of today, and you mentioned platforms, you mentioned where all this informational data is sort of sitting. And when you look at some of the examples of today with YouTube and the other sort of social networks, are the younger generations, are they inheriting platforms faster than they can inherit the civic framework to help them understand these things? And we talked about depth and you talked about flattening. Is there a risk, a cultural risk, if these younger generations are inheriting these platforms faster than they inherit the civic framework to go with it? And what does the story still play? The story's telling still play in the idea of social cohesion. I'm sort of putting two questions together there because I fear for social cohesion with the plethora of social networks.
I need to think deeply about that. Uh, I'm concerned for the youth today. Nothing will ever replace the lived experience of a human being in the presence of another human.
Yeah,
Something special
yeah,
happens. And if I was to think of it from a data perspective, where you couldn't calculate the data points, uh, we've we've identified 700 trillion different combinations with 90% of the most selected responses in Cultural Infusion's Atlas. And I don't even think quantum computing will ever get there. I know there's a huge event happening now at the Vatican to really distinguish what is a human and what is a robot. Now,
yeah.
is AI ever going to be human? Of course, it's not going to be human. It doesn't feel like us. It doesn't have skin like us. Um, it doesn't feel empathy like us because our empathy is going to be also based on so many other experiences that we've had. It won't have had all that experience. Every time you go to ChatGPT and you ask it a question, and I ask it a question, and anyone who asks the same question, it's going to give a different response. And that different response is going to be based on all sorts of assumptions it makes on who's behind the keyboard. Is it ever going to get it right? Of course, it's not going to get it right. So the impact of uh, on humanity, I think humanity will prevail, and the reason why is because uh, we're collective at the end of the day.
Yeah.
We want to be in the presence of the other. We want to experience storytelling. We want to experience touch. We have these five senses, that dominate the the experience of learning. And I don't think you can separate, touch, sight, feeling, uh, from the experience of wisdom and what it means to be a human. Because there's an
You made a
embodied
really great point
process that
about
goes on with learning, you know.
you made a great point about nothing substitutes a conversation in the presence of another human being. You can't have that conversation with an AI bot or something like that. And that's what's sort of worrying, isn't it? That it's that the digital is side is accelerating at such a rate that it's fragmenting us, but at the same time, it's putting us on the same sort of curve, so to speak. So let me ask you one last question before we jump to the conclusion. What do you think, what aspect of human culture is perhaps the most fragile right now in this moment?
Well, I would say the work that I do around intercultural understanding, according to UNESCO, I think it's 87 or 89% of all conflict that's happening in the world is happening in areas where there's low levels of intercultural capability.
Mm.
According to UNESCO, 75% of all the conflict that we have in the world has a cultural dimension. That equates to something like $15 trillion of the global economy, and that's been increasing since 2008. And that's around the same time the social media exploded on the scene. So I think we need to invest a lot more in understanding culture in its entirety. And I bring it back to the work that Paul Schaefer, has been espousing. We need to transform from this economic age to this age of culture. And I think that's the only thing that's going to save humanity at the end of the day. Because we're human beings are cultural beings, essentially. We create cultures, we live inside cultures, and we need to understand culture in its entirety. We need to do a lot more at it because we can address, the cost of not understanding each other. And
So
that's
you
not,
would
I'm
think,
not only talking about, cultural conflict. If you start to add to that how we, gender disparity, how we treat people with disabilities, how people are racialized and the cost of that on a daily basis. These are big numbers. So by investing in this, we can start to shift the dial a little bit, and which essentially can mean more money can go into other areas of the economy to build human capacity.
yeah,
And this is
there's a
this
huge
is going to be the
opportunity
age of
cost.
culture.
Yeah, there's a huge opportunity cost to where that can be reaped, isn't there? And I don't want to fall into the economic trap, but there's a huge economic opportunity because we don't get these things right. And I was going to ask a question about, what the educational institutions and civic life can do. What role should they play? But you sort of half answered that, and you talked about education, you've talked about creating empathy, you've talked about eliminating ignorance. So I think that's it. But if you were to say one last thing for the role of education institutions and civic life in correcting this or helping us get on track, and this is not falling down the digital age trap, what would you say that would be? I have an idea in my head, and we're listening to it. It's almost as more human contact would be a good thing. But what
Yeah,
else do you
yeah,
think?
yeah, absolutely. And I wrote an article recently that was based on the labyrinth that I first visited in Crete. And you probably know the story of Ariadne's thread and Theseus who goes there to kill the Minotaur. But the
Yeah.
labyrinth was also a metaphor for how we work through complexity. And it wasn't about, the outcome. It was about life is incredibly complex. And when we're working through complexity, it needs to be, underpinned And I'm referring now to the dialogue because life is one story at the end of the day, and we're engaging in storytelling. And that storytelling needs to be underpinned by kindness and respect. Um, and the premise doesn't have to be agreement, but if we conduct that storytelling with absolute kindness and respect for the other, it brings us closer together. And my concern now is that uh, technology, hybrid threats, external actors are driving a wedge in society. And what we're seeing is the rise of demagoguery. We're not talking to each other. And in many ways, um, the rise of extremism is a response to the absence of unity.
Yeah.
So we need to come together. We need to all lean in. Call it love. I always say to people, find people who are totally unlike you. If you're going to have a discussion about someone, invite people to that discussion who don't agree with you. Because what you're going to explore during that process is you're going to develop some empathy and you're going to like that person, even if they don't agree with you. That's going to bring you closer. And as we develop these friendships, those friendships will see us beyond um, what's dividing us at the moment. And that's a lot more powerful than anything else.
Well, it will certainly broaden our horizons. And I think broadening horizon, I'm not playing on the horizon word here, but that's what we want to do, don't we? We want to broaden our horizons. And by opening up ourselves, in fact, to other cultures and other opinions, other ways of thinking. So one last question for you. We've talked about the digital age. We've talked about the fact that young people today are to some extent prisoners of the digital age. They're not necessarily talking to one another. So, what would you want the younger, I won't say young because you and I are both young, the younger generation, what would you want them to think or to understand about culture and cultural encounters and shared human life to sort of get the most out of their life in this new cultural age and escaping the clutches, shall we say, of the digital economic age?
Spend more time being in the physical presence of other human beings. Put your devices down and engage in just storytelling. Learn to become a better communicator and start picking up books. I don't think we spend enough time reading, and I think reading allows us to think critically, deeply. It helps us to structure our ideas, and we're not living. We're not in this fleeting moment where we're scrolling, doom scrolling. I found
Yeah.
myself doing that a few times, and I thought, my God, what am I doing? This is highly addictive. But
It's
if you,
addictive and
well,
brainless, yes.
yeah, I mean, if you want to become a critical thinker, and we need more critical thinkers than ever, that requires you to be able to focus for a long period of time on one particular topic because you can't do that by spending 3 seconds on a TikTok feed. And you can't go off to TikTok and get your latest academic citation. I hear my kids all the time coming to me and say, "Oh, I saw it on TikTok, Dad." And
Very
I don't
reliable
go to
source.
TikTok, but I want to know what they see on TikTok, and they get their news from TikTok. But they don't. My kids don't even watch TV anymore. A little bit of
Uh,
reality TV, and they'll usually go to Netflix to watch the reality TV because they don't want the commercials, and they'll fast track through the commercials. But life is very different. I don't know what the impact of this is. I think we need to do more study on this. We need to
uh,
understand the impact of this on the cultural being, the human.
yeah. You keep coming back to something that is very close to my heart too, and you talked about books, you talked about storytelling, and it takes me back to my primary school age in Australia when we used to study Aboriginal culture, and we used to always talk about the dream time, and the dream time is storytelling. So that suggests that the culture of storytelling goes back tens of thousands of years across many, many cultures, and maybe that's part of the essence of what makes us people, is this ability to tell stories as a way of bringing us alive. And it's just a lasting. It was just a last minute observation of mine because I'm a big believer in storytelling too, and yet all of the cultures we've discussed, they have a tradition of storytelling, and we're losing it.
We are losing it. And, one of the stories that I often tell is when I first went to Pakistan, I was taken to the Museum of Lahore, and I was very familiar with that whole convergence of Hellenic and Hindu thought. I've even got a book there behind me called The Shape of Ancient Thought,
Uh-huh.
which postulates that modern day thought is really based on a convergence of Hellenic and Hindu thought coming together. And that Hellenistic period, when Alexander had expanded to South Asia, was this enormous period of confluence that really laid down the foundation for so much advancement in so many different disciplines. But in the Museum of Lahore, they've got this bilingual coin. It dates back 2,000 years ago. On one side, it's
Amazing.
Greek. It's one of the first bilingual coins in the world, from that part of the world. And on the other side is Kharoshthi, which was the script that they use in Aramaic script for the local language of the people there. So what does that tell you about even the idea of inclusion going back 2,000 years ago? We
Amazing.
think these are modern day concepts. But what does it also tell you about how we can synthesize new settings that can bring about these incommensurate cultural differences? That didn't happen without storytelling. I can tell you that now. There were a lot of stories that were told, and there were a lot of conversations that went on. And there were conversations about how do I include the other? How do I make sure that I can you know, find ways that they're going to feel valued and their aspects of their identity are going to feel valued? And I think that's an incredible
That's
story
awesome.
because that also speaks to that slogan, diversified we grow. Um, what's facing humanity at the moment is global challenges, and global challenges require global approaches. And the more wisdom we can bring together that's tied up to cultures of the world, it means we bring greater, we amplify the data set that allows us to, you know, uh, bring about possibilities of being able to, solve those challenges.
Yeah. Just a concluding remark from me. I mean, one thing that this conversation seems to make very clear or very difficult to ignore is that culture is some sort of invisible framework through which societies actually remain coherent and relational and human. And perhaps that's one of the risks facing modern societies is that not the culture disappears entirely, but that it becomes increasingly symbolic, while other systems increasingly shape how people live, behave, and relate to one another underneath it. So, anyway, our next Horizon episode will move directly into that territory through the question of artificial intelligence and what happens when digital systems begin to shape learning, behavior, judgment, and identity at enormous scale. We've already talked a little bit about this in the TikTok. So, look, thanks again, Peter, for the generosity and the
Thank you,
depth
Michael.
of your discussion and insights. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on Horizon.